Our first category of evidence of the flood is genetic evidence. By the way, just before we start to look at genetic evidence of the flood itself, are you aware that advances in secular genetic research, particularly mitochondrial DNA, which provides a far more accurate tracing of genetic lineage, is actually rapidly decimating and destroying the theory of evolution? Evolution at a genetic level simply does not exist. Modern man, for instance, Cro-Magnon man, is not genetically related to Neanderthal man, and has no common ancestry with him or with any of the other humanoids in the so-called evolutionary tree of man. Likewise, many other look-alike species, originally thought to be from the same branches on the evolutionary tree, have also been found to be genetically unrelated. They simply look similar, but have no common ancestry whatsoever. In addition, the simple to complex life form of evolution that they thought existed doesn't exist. All life forms are, from day one, incredibly complex genetically. It was recently discovered that the humble and supposedly simple early life form on the evolutionary tree, the sea anemone, is actually more genetically complex than man himself. But back to the genetic evidence of the flood. As this is a relatively new science, the list for this category is relatively short. In fact, it consists of just one discovery, but it is a very compelling and significant discovery nonetheless. The sudden reduction of the population of mankind to 8 individuals would create a severe bottleneck in man's gene pool. Therefore, if the flood actually happened, we would expect to find in the genetic makeup of the human race a pattern that corresponded to such a bottleneck in our genetic history. Recent advances in genetics, especially in the study of mitochondrial DNA, has allowed biologists to more or less map the genetic history of mankind. And it has thrown quite a few sizable spanners in the old evolutionary theories, as we saw. But on February the 21st, 2008, ABC News reported that 2 such studies confirmed the theories that modern man began in Africa and emigrated out from there, which is consistent with the biblical account. But something else in the genetic pattern puzzled them, because the pattern was not as it should have been. That was until they thought to run a computer simulation of a genetic bottleneck and found it predicted the pattern they were observing perfectly. According to the ABC report, and I quote, "The studies published in the journal Nature paint a picture of a population of humans emigrating off the African continent and then shrinking at some point because of unknown adversity. Later populations grew and spread from this smaller genetic pool of founder ancestors, a phenomenon known as a bottleneck." Basically, it means that the genetic history of mankind does not look like this. It looks like this. Which is precisely as it would be expected to look if there had been a worldwide flood that wiped out the bulk of mankind's gene pool and then regenerated it from a smaller population of survivors. Okay, let's move along now to mythological evidence. Now, if there had been a worldwide flood from which only a few survived to tell the tale to future generations, you would expect to find variations of that same handed-down story popping up in the mythological heritage of most, or at least many, of the descendant cultures that arose from those survivors, which, of course, is all the cultures of the earth. And again, we indeed do find that such is the case. Anthropologists and other social sciences have identified great flood stories in the mythologies of between 200 to 500, and some even say up to 600, separate cultures around the world. Many of these cultures developed in isolation, not only in different parts of a country, but also separately on the different continents, and many of the far-flung island-bound cultures that dot our oceans. While some have been more corrupted than others, there's a striking similarity between most of them. Most of them identify this flood as a judgment from a god or gods, as punishment on an evil or wicked world. Most declare that the flood was prophesied or foretold before it came. Many of them speak of a small band of survivors who then repopulated the earth, having survived using some form of craft or floating raft or log. A significant number of them include animals being saved on the craft also. Again, a significant number of them record a bird as being used to test if the flood was over. But most surprising is the number of these separate ancient cultural stories that have as the main character a man whose name is a variation of or closely resembles the name Noah. Now, also in the mythology department, you would also expect to find scattered around the globe stories of a lost, ancient, advanced civilization, able to do many wonderful things. A golden age where man could do almost godlike things, seemingly wise and knowledgeable beyond any current civilization. Such stories might speak of incredible machines, even flying machines, and abilities and the use of forces beyond their imagination, such as the ancient Sanskrit Hindu texts of India, such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, which speak of an ancient civilization boasting many forms of vehicles, including flying machines, such as the flying and heavily armed Vimanas, even craft capable of space flight, it seems. A veritable arsenal of various deadly weapons and missiles, even a weapon using reflective discs and emitting a deadly and destructive beam of light, which sounds awfully similar to our laser technology. Then there is the launchable weapon of mass destruction that seems to create something that appears, by the description of it, to be very much like a nuclear explosion. Now, the text translations that I've read at the Internet Sacred Text Archive at www.sacred-text.com seem, to me, to be translated into English by somebody attempting to rationalise the text into something more acceptable to the traditional view of ancient technology. But, again to me, it also seems as if the original writers were struggling to describe a technology they observed but did not fully understand. In fact, hardly understood. Now, from their many references to celestial beings and powerful celestial weapons and craft and so on, as distinct, and they make that distinction, from the more primitive, but still relatively well advanced, weapons and powers of humans, it would seem that they openly speak in terms of observing an alien technology wielded by non-humans, and also they speak of those crossbred between humans and these non-human but of higher intelligence beings. This is interesting because the Bible speaks of the pre-flood times when there were Nephilim on the earth, which by inference are non-human and who are no longer on the earth. It also speaks of the sons of God, the Elohim, marrying the daughters of men and having such crossbred children, the so-called heroes of old, men of renown. The Bible also speaks of a non-human great war that began in heaven and ended on the earth, with the banishment of Satan and a third of the angels upon it. Very interesting. But more on that in the archaeological section. But a brief word of warning, mainly to Christians, but also to any who are seeking the truth. While the reality of these pre-flood civilizations and events must be acknowledged, because even the Bible acknowledges them, and the ancient texts of India and Hinduism may possibly be accounts of these things that have survived the Great Flood, it is important that we do not follow their ways. We must always remember that it is these civilizations that grieved the Lord so much that he destroyed them from off the face of the earth. These things I mention serve only as evidence that the Lord and his written word, the Bible, indeed speaks the truth. In short, they are yet additional and credible evidence that point to the reality of the flood of Noah that the Bible speaks of. Now, in the next session, we'll examine the massive, quite literally, geological evidence that exists and would be expected to exist after such a